Hey everyone, School Psych Podcast is back. This is our third week in a row, so we've been hard at work, but really excited tonight. I hope that everybody is kind of getting into the groove in their schools. We're going into October, so might be getting some eval requests and transfers and all that fun stuff. I wanted to mention too, I was really excited. I went to a PD here in Maryland where one of the nearby counties kind of hosted a panel discussion. It was on how to effectively manage your caseload and time-saving tips and things like that. So we had like this panel of experienced school psychs, and they were sharing how they would, time management and how they would have a couple shortcuts and tricks. And I thought that was a really cool platform just to hear. We don't always need to be paying fancy people to come in and talk to us. We have really good resources, I think, all around us. So got me thinking too about the EdCamp model and what some teachers are doing as far as like getting a centralized location and everyone coming in and just sharing ideas and thoughts as a low cost PD opportunity. If anyone out there is watching in Maryland and is interested in something like that, I'd love for you to contact me because I think that's really cool. But real excited for tonight. My name is Rachel. I should have introduced myself first. I'm a school psychologist and I'm in Maryland, and Rebecca's going to tell us a little bit how you can participate tonight. Rebecca?
Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca. I'm a school psychologist working in the state of Connecticut. And the easiest way to participate, if you are watching us live right now on YouTube, is to put your comments and questions right next to the video screen in the live chat box. We'll be looking out for notifications there. Also, you can feel free to comment on either of the Facebook pages, the School Psych Podcast page or School Psych to your school psychologist, and comment in messages privately, comment right onto the page on visitor posts, comment under the event, and also on Twitter using the hashtag #PsychedPodcast, which you should see under my name here. And now here's Anna.
Hi guys, I'm Anna, school psych working in New York State. We had a little poll going to try to generate some conversation about our event tonight. Our question was, how are students with executive functioning difficulties supported at your school site? The top response by far was, for gen ed students, there's little or no support for EF difficulties. That was 42 votes. In second place at 14 votes, the school psychologist works with the teacher to implement in-class supports. And a close third place with 13 votes is formal ongoing support from a school psych, SLP, or other professional via IEP or 504 plan. And then at many less votes, we had some other provisions put in place, or just it was the teacher's responsibility kind of thing. So not a lot of formal interventions in place for kids with EF difficulties is kind of what I took away from that. I'd like to introduce our guest, Hanna Bogen. Hanna is a CCC-SLP. She's a speech-language pathologist with a primary focus on therapies that support self-regulation, social communication, and executive functioning as they relate to successful communication. In addition to providing individuals and groups therapy services, Hanna trains and consults with schools and therapy teams to support greater understanding of how students develop and use metacognitive thinking to build self-regulation, executive functioning capacities, and social regulation skills. Thanks for joining us tonight, Hanna.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be here. Yeah, this is actually really exciting for me. I usually get to rub shoulders with other SLPs. I do a lot of work with teachers and school teams, but to be able to connect specifically with school psychologists who I think are actually very sort of uniquely set up to support a lot of these students is fantastic. So I'm very excited to have been invited to chat.
Thanks, Hanna. I'm so excited to have you. I first heard you on another podcast and thought the same thing, like, wow, this work that she's doing is so interesting, and I could take what she's saying and apply it to my work tomorrow. And so that's what I'm so interested to learn more from you about. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe give us kind of an overview of how you support students by teaching them about the brain and executive functioning and metacognition? Kind of give us the framework for what you do.
Absolutely. And I'm going to apologize for anybody, if you're watching it live and you see me drinking tea, I probably, like many of you, am now, of course, sick because all of the kids that we work with are back at school and are sharing all of their germs with us. So I am desperately trying to avoid a coughing fit. So if you see me drinking tea, it's not because I'm cavalier and above everybody and think I should drink tea in the middle of a podcast. It's hopefully to save you guys from the hacking that will ensue. It's actually a little bit unique to be in the world of SLPs and also to do so much work with executive functioning. My first job out of graduate school was working in a clinic up in the Bay Area where we almost exclusively did group therapy, and it was with adolescents and teens who were complicated, meaning a lot of these kids they didn't have clear-cut diagnoses. It wasn't like you could pull from the book and come up with something that was going to help them. These were all students who were struggling with social communication in one way or another. They were having a hard time being successful in the world with other people. And a lot of that had to do with impulse difficulties. There was a lot of processing difficulties going on, but these were kids who tended to have, they were the kids who you might say were falling through the cracks in school because many of them weren't qualifying for supports, but they clearly had something that was going on, and it made school hard and it made social relationships really hard. So the more I got to know these kids, the more I learned about and researched executive functioning. I would say the overarching theme of working with this group is these were students who were disorganized on a lot of different levels, right? So picture a lot of the students that you are thinking of with executive functioning challenges, like they're physically disorganized many times, they're disorganized in their material management, they're linguistically disorganized, they're sort of cognitively disorganized. It doesn't mean they're not intelligent, but their ability to coordinate those thoughts and produce something is challenged. And it felt like staying inside my little bubble of being a speech-language pathologist and, working on something that was so narrow and language-based or articulation-based was an injustice to these students who needed additional support and needed us to look at where was their dysregulation coming from, and how could we not only give them tools, but how could we empower them to understand themselves well enough that they could actually use the tools? Because if I'm going to be a student's frontal lobe for them, I'm not doing them a lot of favors, because then if I'm not around, right, who's going to support them?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And so were these students being referred to you by classroom teachers or parents or both? And how did that work in your building? Do you know if there are school psychologists in your building or school counselors that also did some of this kind of work?
So this was in a private practice setting, and we were getting kids from all over. Many of these students, interestingly enough, did not have school psychologists involved. They may have had a school psychologist involved in the initial assessment. And I know that this varies dramatically, not only state to state, but being in California and now I live in Los Angeles, just district to district, we see so much variance in the role of the school psychologist in assessment and in ongoing intervention. And I would say, I wish that there was more of the opportunity of a role for a lot of school psychologists that I know in ongoing intervention, because they tend to be utilized for assessment only, and then they're not available to students, which is so frustrating because they're sort of exactly the support system that many of these students need. So a lot of these kids didn't have significant enough communication disorders. It's not like they were, below the 7th percentile across the board on all their language assessments to qualify for in-depth intervention. And even if they did, a lot of the SLPs that are working in schools just don't have the background in executive functioning to know how to support that side of things. So you end up with kids who get a lot of, in the school setting, these kids were having a lot of targeted goals for things like like narratives, like how to write a more organized, cohesive narrative, right? Or how to summarize information from a book, and be able to put it into a short answer form test question. But how that translated into the real world for these kids, who many of them struggled with impulse inhibition. Like, think of your core executive functions, no matter whose list you're going to pull from, like the core executive functions, right? Impulse inhibition, working memory, cognitive flexibility. These were exactly the areas these kids were falling apart in. And frankly, find me an SLP who has enough training in any of those areas to provide appropriate ongoing support. And we might have been the only service that was being offered to these kids in the school setting. So many of these kids were coming to the private practice for additional therapy around social communication. And we were finding that in order to help them be more socially successful, we had to address the executive functioning difficulties that were going on. So it kind of came a little bit out of necessity to learn some of this stuff.
Yeah, I like it so much. It reminds me of the social thinking curriculum and that aspect of speech pathology, social communication. But it's more than that as well. It's more than just, expected, unexpected behaviors. It's this ability to take these executive functioning skills and make them less mysterious to children, to students, so that they know where they are and what they're working on. So tell us a little bit about how you begin and how do you, how do you present this to kids, and what have you noticed and what they take away from that kind of thing when they are having these kind of struggles with disorganization and impulse control or inhibition?
Sure. So I think the first step is to ask yourself, as the person helping them, how it is that you think about executive functioning and how you think about the brain. So two different things. I'm going to start with how at least I think about executive functioning. I am certainly not going to purport that I am the expert or even really an expert in executive functioning. All of my professional crushes are like the experts in executive functioning. They're the people that I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm George McCloskey. Let's, get drinks. But and he's speaking at a conference coming up, and I'm so bummed because I'm not going to be able to go. But at a minimum, I would encourage anybody who's working with these students to just have your working model of executive functioning sort of set for yourself. And I'm going to share the one that makes a lot of sense for me, because the laundry lists of executive functions, right? The things like task initiation, prioritization, even like impulse inhibition, working memory. I can agree that maybe those things are in deficit for a certain student, but that doesn't give me a lot of direction about what that looks like for them in the real world and where to go from there. Like the logical question is, okay, so they have a deficit in working memory, like now what, right? All of our research says we can't dramatically improve working memory. So do we just like pat them on the back and say bummer? So no, we don't. We have to apply it into a functional model for executive functioning. So the ed therapist, Carrie Lindemuth, who I co-created Brain Talk with, she and I use this working model of executive functioning that we call the Oreo cookie model. Okay, so everybody picture an Oreo cookie. You've got 2 layers of cookie, and we're going to call those 2 layers of self-regulation. And you've got this cream layer in the middle, which we're going to call strategic thinking. Okay, simplify it even more. Top layer of self-regulation is pausing. The middle cream layer is planning, and then the final self-regulation layer is doing. Okay, so if you think about all of those separate executive functions, when they're working in beautiful tandem, right? When they're working in conjunction like this lovely orchestra, what you get is an individual who can pause an initial impulse long enough to not just react. Because if all you're doing is reacting, you are not engaging executive functions. It might work out sometimes. It's kind of like rolling the dice, but you're not engaging executive functions. Okay, so you have to pause whatever that impulse is. And many students break down at that level. impulse inhibition is complicated and it's multifaceted, and it's hard for a lot of kids with a lot of different diagnoses or undiagnosed. And we'll talk about how to help those kids. Once you've paused, you have to make a plan for what you're going to do instead. Okay, so if you are a fourth grader and you're at recess, and that's the place where you get dysregulated the most, and you're playing kickball, and instead of, the pitcher does a beautiful roll pitch to you, they do the bounce pitch, which is like the classic dysregulatory trigger for a fourth grader at recess. You have to pause your impulse to pick up that ball and chuck it back at the pitcher, right? But once you've paused it, what's the plan? What are you going to do instead? And that's where you really rely on all of those strategic thinking skills. And once you have a plan, you're right back to self-regulation, because you have to follow the plan. You have to have the self-regulation to then get through whatever you come up with. And those of us who use executive functioning well, we go through that process, that Oreo cookie, over and over and over and over and over and over again, all day long, with little things, big things. Sometimes we don't do a very good job, but that is sort of what it looks like when you're engaging executive functioning well. It is both self-regulation and strategic thinking. So understanding it that way is helpful, because kids can break down at any one of those three levels, and it gives you a place to start, right? So if I know that a student is breaking down with impulse inhibition, if I jump right to, I'm going to teach them how to prioritize their homework, but they actually can't manage the impulse of they get home and they want to turn on their computer instead of doing homework. It doesn't matter how great the plan is for what to do first, they're not going to get there. Right. So having some model of executive functioning matters, to know how to intervene with students, and then know how to talk about the brain, because that's where I would start with students who struggle with executive functioning. We need to teach them what's going on in their brain. And we need to help them build what we call metacognitive knowledge, or sort of intrapersonal knowledge. Mm-hmm. How can they know enough about themselves to know what they need help with, and then how to get that help? So there's lots of brain models. Lots of people have broken this down. And Brain Talk is sort of based on, I guess it's based on a model that Daniel Siegel made especially famous, the upstairs brain, downstairs brain. There's another curriculum called Brain Wise that breaks it into your lizard brain and your wizard brain. The idea is you're separating your emotional lower brain from your logical wrinkly brain. When I talk to teachers or students, people who don't know a lot about this, I say, you have your survival brain, and then you have your thinky stuff on top, right? All the wrinkly stuff. Yeah. And start here. Just talk about their brain, right? Like get some buy-in with students, because this stuff is so cool. I don't care if you go on Amazon, which I have done on multiple occasions, and buy a sheep's brain. They're cheap and they're on 2-day shipping, you guys. But show students that this stuff is real. And in fact, as humans, we have so much wrinkly thinking brain on top of our emotional brain that the reason it's wrinkly is because we couldn't fit it all in there. We had to crumple it up, right? There's really fun ways to talk about this with students, and open up this conversation of your impulses are coming from your emotional survival brain, and there's nothing wrong with you. Your survival brain is doing its job. It's just doing it really well, like a little too well, maybe. Yeah. And so, it thinks in a moment where you are getting triggered and you're getting an impulse to seek something awesome, right? Or avoid something that feels uncomfortable. Essentially what's happening is your survival brain is kicking in and assuming that there's some sort of threat or opportunity that you have to react to very quickly. And so it shuts down communication to your thinking brain, right? It's kind of like this loud, obnoxious voice or alarm going off in your head that's like, no, we don't need any logic here. We got this figured out, right? If it's an impulse to avoid something, I teach kids, there is a part of your brain screaming, we're all gonna die, right? It's panicking. And And this is really useful and helpful, one, if you're a simple mammal, because you know what? If something is uncomfortable, you probably are about to die. And two, if you are in a survival scenario, you need this part of the brain to be there, right? Like we know what happened with older students. Bring in the cool, funky research about what happened when we cut out people's amygdalas and then sat back and were like, maybe they won't be impulsive now. That's not really what happened, right? So you can bring in all this cool research, but talk about this stuff with the students, because what we want to do is set up a foundation for them to separate their identity of a human being from their impulses. Because very quickly, I can't tell you how many students I've worked with who will echo, I am the problem, right? I am a disaster. I am, I make my teacher mad. They take on these roles very quickly and they'll own them. Whereas what we want to do is help them be able to look at their impulses sort of over there and say, man, that impulse didn't work out very well. That reaction was not helpful. And how did it come about? And then only then are you at a point where you have a student who's ready for tools, like, and now what could I do instead? Mm-hmm. We all want to jump to the tools, right? And I love the tools. Don't get me wrong. I'm a huge fan of the zones. The clinic where I worked, where I did all this social regulation work, was the same clinic where Leah Kuypers developed the zones of regulation. I worked with all those same kids, right? Like, I love the zones. I love Hunter and his amazing remote control, right? Your brain is like a remote control. There you go. Thank you. Perfect. Can I just bring you with me to all my talks where you'll just hold up all the visuals?
My remote control.
Yeah. I love all these tools. Mm-hmm. And before you hand a kid a tool, they've got to understand, one, why do I need a tool in the first place? And two, how can I know myself well enough that I know when to activate this tool? Because otherwise, you better be with them in their pocket all the time. Right. And it starts with them understanding where their impulses come from. So, brain talk is based on introducing the characters, sort of the primary characters, if you will, who live in your emotional limbic brain and who live in your logical thinking brain, and how they have a conversation to keep you regulated. It's not the be all end all, right? It was the solution that made sense to me and to Carrie working with our students. But there are brilliant people out there who've also described this in other ways, and that might resonate, even better with you and your students. But know where your kids are breaking down. You got to know that, and talk to them about their brain. Start to build some metacognitive knowledge first.
Yeah.
I've loved so much, I'm jotting down little things that you're saying there. And I love how you simplify things with the Oreo cookie. And in the comment about the kind of, working memory, there's a deficit, like pat on the back type thing. Like, no, we do, even though maybe we can't increase that score, functionally there's things that we can do. So I'm loving all that, but I am going to have to do a little bit of a backtrack. So you mentioned the sheep's brain from Amazon, right? Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, you did. So here's the first time that came about. Okay, I'll be totally honest. I did research, if it's possible to get your hands on a human brain, because I was so determined that in developing Brain Talk, when Carrie and I were developing it, it was humbling because I realized that the kids who sometimes need to hear this stuff the most are the kids who have heard it from so many people that they just can't, right? Like, they don't want to hear it from one more adult about all the tools they need and how they're doing this wrong and that wrong, and why didn't that work out, and what could you do differently? They can tell you when they're regulated. So the buy-in was really tough. And I remember thinking, I just want to show these students that there really is an amygdala in the brain, and there really is a hippocampus. I'm not making this up. I'm not just showing them a drawing from the internet. And sheeps, while they are certainly not humans, a sheep brain cut in half, you can see the amygdala. It looks like a little almond, right? That's what amygdala means in Latin. It means little almond. And so this ability to say to a student, you don't have to believe me, but check it out. You can through plastic. I wouldn't let them touch the sheep's brain. But you can actually poke the amygdala. Look at that. And if this sheep were alive right now and you poked right there, he would have a huge MIG moment, right? But show them the shape of the hippocampus. Like it means seahorse in Latin. It kind of looks like this crazy seahorse. Check it out. Figuring out the buy-in is really tricky with some students because they're really shut down. Yeah. They just don't need another adult explaining to them what they're not doing well. And so figuring out how to talk about this in a neutral enough way that they're interested really helps. And so yes, I have on many occasions brought a sheep's brain in plastic and let kids just check it out.
And I think that's awesome. And that's really my mind initially was like, wow, Amazon sells everything. Like that's where my mind immediately went to, was like Amazon. Like that was just that's just a sheep's brain, but
and also in schools, all the science, like if just go make friends with the science teacher and like order it from the science catalog is probably, that way you can get it reimbursed, you guys. You can get it on a purchase order. That way you're not doing it on your credit card.
Right.
But yeah, and I've seen, there was an example of a great little lesson plan that was based on Daniel Siegel's upstairs downstairs brain model, where they drew a brain, they just drew it on paper and put a line between the upstairs and the downstairs brain and used the little Lego characters to represent the sort of the structures that they also personified and turned into characters who were in those parts of the brain so that kids could play through the process of learning this stuff. And I can't emphasize enough, when you're working with kids, right, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, finding ways for them to play, to engage, that this becomes hands-on. If you use sand trays, do it in a sand tray. If you use bean boxes and sensory bins, use it, but turning it into something that becomes 3D and real for them does wonders. It just takes it off the page or takes it out of the conversation and helps it become more real for them. And for young kids, externalizes it enough that they can sort of act out these scenarios when they're not ready to talk about themselves. Mm-hmm. It's a little easier to talk about the character. Like instead of talking about how I screwed up, it's easier to say, and this is a term from Brain Talk, like if you have a fight, flight, or freeze based reaction, like, oh man, I had a huge MIG moment, and that MIG moment led to, right? It just allows me to talk about it with more safety as a student, which is important.
I also think it's helpful. It gives teachers, if we can share this kind of framework with teachers, it gives them a way to understand that these are skills deficits that they're seeing. They're not sort of purposeful disobedience, or I told him, to stop blurting out, or, like that frustration that we can naturally feel in front of, 26 kids trying to keep calm and trying to keep order in our classroom can dissipate when we recognize that kids are doing the best that they can, and this is the skill level where this child is at, and I can teach the next skill, the second, yes, which may be, based on him becoming more aware of what triggers his MIG moments, or whatever.
Totally. Mm-hmm. I like even thinking about just self-regulation, right? Different people have different definitions of that, and asking yourself, like, well, what does it mean? Like asking a teacher, well, what do you think it means to self-regulate? And a lot of times it's all based around behavior, right? It means that you can behave, that you can control yourself. And I would argue that, one, it's far more complicated than that. And two, like strong self-regulation inherently means that you are aware enough of what's going to trigger you that you can proactively be ready for it. Mm-hmm. So when I work with teachers, I talk about it. This was Carrie Lindemuth, again, Brain Talk's co-developer, her brilliant way of explaining self-regulation, but I teach it as it's regulating your team, your TEAM. And your team is your thoughts and attention, is the T. Your emotional responses is the E. And my soapbox is you cannot control your emotions. They're like the weather, right? They just happen. And I will scream this from the mountaintops. We've got to stop talking about emotions as positive and negative and good and bad. They're comfortable or uncomfortable, because there's nothing bad about feeling angry or disappointed. It's going to happen. It might feel a little uncomfortable, or frankly, feeling angry sometimes feels super comfortable. So bearing that in mind. So that's the E. The A is action, which is what most people get stuck on with self-regulation, right? And that's where you get into impulse inhibition. Can you pause something you're not supposed to do? And can you transition away from a highly preferred task? And can you modulate your intensity within a task? And then the M is motivation. And this is kind of where I was going, which is we are often working with kids who have been chronically unsuccessful. So they are unsuccessful potentially socially, academically, behaviorally, like however you want to look at it. They have this history of not feeling successful. And I don't know if you guys are fans of Rick Lavoie, but Rick Lavoie has a book about motivation and talks about these laws of motivation. And the gist of all of this is that in order to be motivated to do something, it has to feel possible. So if I said to anybody listening, by next week, you have to be ready to, figure skate in the next Winter Olympics. You're like, I'm not motivated to do that. It's not even, maybe it's possible. I shouldn't judge everybody listening, but chances are for most of us, it doesn't feel possible. So our level of motivation to even work towards that is nil.
Yeah.
So for students where we're coming in and saying, this thing is what we're working on, this is your goal, and you've got to work towards it. If their past experience is that they are chronically unsuccessful, then their motivation is probably highly restricted. And I'll say to teachers, there's two ways to help somebody be successful. If you think about your zone of proximal development, either you have to increase capacities, right? Or you have to lower demands. But one of those has to give. And our jobs are to help kids increase their capacities, of course. And that takes time, right? I love it when teachers are like, well, he's in therapy now, so why isn't it changing? And I'm like, he's been to 2 sessions, right? Like, let's give it a second. This stuff takes time. And so in the meantime, sometimes we do have to ask ourselves, what are the demands on these students? And are there places where environmentally we can reduce some of those demands? Not our expectations, right? That's different. Our expectations are still high for these kids, but maybe some of the demands so they know what success feels like, and they're more motivated. And that's just thinking about the self-regulation piece. But it's big because these students, I think that for many of them, they've accepted those roles and they're just ready to be in that role forever. As the kid who doesn't turn their homework in, right? Or the student who doesn't write down what they're supposed to do. Because it's not about having the right planner. It's that they need deeper support.
Yeah. And I see that a lot too, kind of with, we'll write a behavior plan or a point sheet or something, and I'll check in with the teacher and they'll be like, oh, it's not working. And I'll ask, well, have they been earning the rewards this week? No, he hasn't earned any rewards. And it's like, okay, then we kind of he needs to have some success. We need to adjust this threshold of which we deem as reward worthy,
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. Backing up and really thinking for every student you work with, I call them reward windows. Like how far out can we set a reward for it to actually be more motivating than whatever the impulse of the moment is? And, developmentally, we know that the window is super, super short the younger you are, and then it slowly expands. But the research that's been done with adults even puts caps on those reward windows where there's only so far out you can place something for it to actually override the desire to do something impulsive in the moment. So I say to parents, it doesn't mean that, you're doing the big, huge reward. 4 times a day, but what can be the interim sort of placeholder that is building up to that reward? And then over time, we can fade it, right? So, also our research tells us that highly consistent rewards actually are less motivating for people, right? This is like the psychology of gambling. Like if you won every time, it actually eventually, I mean, if it's money every time, then we'd all be gamblers. But if you're just getting the same reward every single time, it's actually not that motivating. So things like he's earning the chance, or he's earning, the opportunity to roll a dice. And if it's an odd number, then he gets the reward. And if it's an even number, then he doesn't. Or to flip a coin, or like building in ways to slowly increase that reward window is great. But assuming that a student has to be perfect for the whole week, because it's silly, because then Monday rolls around and they have a stumbling block and they feel like they've blown it. So why even try for the rest of the week?
Yeah.
So that's, yeah.
For kids with real significant EF challenges, like maybe students with ADHD or anxiety, do you make the reward, do you set up the rewards differently? Because as Russ Barkley might say, those children are significantly delayed in the development of these skills compared to their peers, so they really need that external reminder. So we're not expecting them maybe to control the impulse, but if we can get them to notice the impulse even after that, there's our success, right?
Yes. So 2 things. One is I definitely agree that basing something on age is always dangerous, right? To say like, well, 11-year-olds, generally can have a reward for this amount of time into the future, and it works. Because yes, right, the ADHD brain, we know sort of on average is delayed. I think that they say like up to 3 years or around 3 years.
30%.
Is what Russell Barkley, I think is what comes out of a lot of his research. So my big thing is whatever extrinsic reward system makes sense for that student, just pair it with a lot of intrinsic reinforcement. And the way I will describe that to parents or teachers is intrinsic motivation is the ability to use emotional motivation. So I tell kids, it means you're emotivated. You're emotionally motivated, that you can use the future feeling of success to motivate the present moment of difficulty. Like if you're so stuck on this feels uncomfortable, I hate this, spelling is hard, I'm terrible at spelling, then of course you're not motivated to work on spelling. Nobody would be. No logical person would work on spelling with that attitude. But most of us, if we do this well, can say, oh, it's just going to feel like such a relief. It's going to be so awesome when this is done. That means I can go, if I'm a kid, I can go play. I can, get my screen time, whatever. Of course, that's probably what most kids are earning these days. So we use that future feeling to motivate present action. That is hard. And I would argue none of us are intrinsically motivated all the time. Like most of us love what we do. And many days we wake up and we do it because we really care about the kids we work with. And on the days where you would rather just stay in bed, your extrinsic motivator is a paycheck, right? Kids don't have a paycheck. Like that isn't, they don't have that sort of concrete extrinsic motivator. So asking ourselves, like, are we still building intrinsic motivation even when we pair it with an extrinsic reward of some kind? So maybe they earn, I think about a second grader whose family I worked with, and the thing that he was earning, which was brilliant, he was a huge Star Wars fan, and they found this giant wall set of Star Wars decals for his bedroom, but he earned them in bits. And the whole idea was, by the time this scene was finished on his wall, it was this very concrete reminder for him of like, look at this. Every time you look at this wall, like you can think about how successful you were. And I loved that because they paired it with the emotion. They always paused in those moments of success and said, How do you feel? Whoa, this is so cool. You feel proud. We feel proud. Let's really think about how this feels right now. And I bet something hard might come along. Like, remember when that was a little bit tricky? And you can remember how awesome this feeling is and know that that's going to come again. Like, who does that? This family did it. It was so cool. And that became the priority over the decal, which was still motivating for him. But you saw how they paired it so beautifully and so successfully for this child who had a diagnosis of ADHD, was in a private school setting, but a private school that was highly academic and, frankly, for being an amazing school, didn't provide a lot of opportunity. They didn't really accommodate the sensory needs that he had throughout the day, as well as, maybe he needed. And I'm not sure that there was a magic school setting that would have been ideal for him. School is just really tough for a lot of kids. So that's the one. The other place that I was going to go with supporting kids with ADHD is making sure that they get better at anticipating their triggers. Many kids with executive functioning challenges, I've heard parents or teachers describe it as it's like every time is the first time for them. Like, they are surprised by how triggered they are every single time, even though I knew they were going to get triggered. Like, I could tell that kid, every time you go out to recess and play basketball with these three people, you are going to get triggered and react. But that child doesn't know it about themselves. And there's lots of reasons for that you can dig into with, is it how they're coding it, right? How their hippocampus is sort of recording that experience for them. Emotion obviously clouds how we code and narrate our experiences, right? So how we feel often dictates the story we would tell ourselves about how something went. When I'm mad, you want to justify that emotion. So you create a narrative that justifies that emotion. Kids do the same thing. So the tool that we made for Brain Talk, when we introduced the hippocampus and this whole idea of your personal memory center, Miss Hip is the hippocampus, and she's like the brain's librarian. And she keeps track of your past facts and feelings. And PAST is an acronym. It's the people, actions, space, and time. None of this stuff is groundbreaking, you guys, I promise. It's the parts of a summary. People, action, space, and time. It's story grammar. But the beauty of separating past facts and feelings is that technically, no matter how you felt, the facts should probably be the same for everybody involved, right? Because the same people were there. Technically, you were doing these things. So you can kind of jolt kids. It's like, write down the emotion. If it was a super strong emotion, write it really big. If it was just kind of a gentle emotion, maybe write it small. And then we're going to fold that piece of paper over and set it aside for a minute. Now we have to think of the facts. What were the past facts? Who was there? What were you all doing? Where was it? The space, and when was it? And the reason we keep track of these things is because eventually you want kids to find past patterns, which is, holy cow, every time you're with these people, you get triggered. Isn't that interesting? Right? Or every time you're playing a video game right before bed, that's a trigger. Because they need to anticipate these triggers. We are much better at managing impulses when we can anticipate that we're about to be triggered. So I'll say to, again, talking about this with parents and teachers. I don't know if you're all Trader Joe's people, but you could use the Costco analogy, but I always say, I know that if I have to shop at Trader Joe's on a Sunday afternoon, I'm going to get triggered. Because it's total absurdity, no matter what Trader Joe's you go to, right? Like, there's nowhere to park. They're like inevitably going to be out of cheddar rockets, and it's just a thing. Or if you shop at Costco on a Saturday, same thing. And if I know that is a trigger for me, then I can proactively regulate. One, I could choose a different time to go. Two, I could if I have to go, because remember, kids can't always escape their triggers, maybe I listen to a podcast while I'm in there. Maybe I say, once I'm done with this, I'm going to do this rewarding thing right after, right? But I can anticipate it so I stay regulated. But if I'm shocked every time I show up at Trader Joe's on a Sunday, then I'm going to be snippy and frustrated and overwhelmed. And now my limbic brain is in high gear, and it's really hard for my logical thinking brain to do any of those Oreo steps. It's just going to be harder. So yeah, your kids with ADHD, really focus on those, helping them find the patterns to their dysregulation.
Love it. And the logical thinking brain has a character name as well, right?
Yeah, I guess I should mention, so in the curriculum, we have sort of 4 primary characters of the brain. You have MIG, the amygdala, and MIG has MIG moments, and they lead to fight, flight, or freeze. And the big goal of teaching kids about MIG is help them realize, what does fight, flight, freeze look like for them? Are they more of a fight kid? Like they argue, they get defensive, right? They yell. A flight kid can look like procrastinating, right? Like, well, I didn't get started because I had to change the font 14 times, or I didn't know what color it was supposed to be, so I just didn't do it. That's flight mode. Freeze or flooded, people call it different things, is often, I'll see this the most with my kids who have processing difficulties, and they just shut down because they don't have enough time, and they know it. Yeah. Another thing you'll see with a lot of these kids, a student aptly named this for himself. He called it turtling, and he would just take his sweatshirt and like over the course of class do this. It was like, it just like went up. He would just disappear because he was so triggered that he just was trying to shut out all the stimulus around him. So that's your amygdala, your avoid impulse. Buster is your seek impulse. And Buster gives you a Buster Bam. It's your grab and gulp, right? It's, this opportunity seems so amazing that I have to grab it and gulp it before it disappears. And that's your kind of dopamine driven, your pleasure and reward circuit, basal structures driven impulse. Your hippocampus, of course, kind of lives in both. Like, it's a really nice segue. It's technically in the limbic system, but it's a pretty logical structure. So we'll kind of talk about it like it's this in between, if you will, and that's Miss Hip, your brain's library. And then the prefrontal cortex, or your thinking brain, is the professor. And the professor always has a little, like, they're just hand-drawn characters, and they have little whiteboard animated videos that go with each unit. But the professor has this little time machine, because we do introduce the phenomenon, and I really do mean the phenomenon, of mental time travel to kids, and how cool it is that humans are unique in our ability to use mental time travel, that our brains can think out into the future and say, what do I want to accomplish out in the future? And then they can cast themselves into the past. What do I know from the past? How can Miss Hip help me to know what's worked and what hasn't, to help me make a plan for right now? So picture an infinity loop where the point that they meet, Carrie and I call this the loop of shiftability, because it's all about shift, okay? But just an infinity loop, and you've got the future out here. You can think out into the future, what do I want? And then you're cruising back, what do I know from the past to help me make a plan right now? And that movement is so, so critical, and it is uniquely human. It's way cool that we can do that. By the way, that loop is also really useful as a visual for a lot of things, like problem identification on one side, problem solving on the other. If you get kids who get stuck in like, this is the problem, and I hate him, and I hate her, and this was dumb, and I hate school, that's problem identification. They're doing a really nice job of identifying problems, but they're a little stuck. So again, we have to help them shift to problem solving and show them like, wow, we're really getting a dark line over here. We got to shift over a little bit. You can use it for my idea, your idea, right? Like some perspective taking, like, man, we've really been talking about your idea for a long time. I don't know if I'm super interested in this topic anymore because we haven't thought about my idea or my plan, your plan. You can do all kinds of stuff with that shifting loop.
That's good.
Yeah.
I love it. Love the characters. I love how simple they are, and how interesting. I think they make for a great story. I'm looking forward to looking more into the animated whiteboard videos.
Yeah, they're all very short. I can admit that Carrie and I learned that we don't actually know how to make whiteboard animated videos through the process of making 8 whiteboard animated videos. We're very lucky that her husband was able to step in and help us because he does some software stuff. Oh, cool. But actually, they really held true to our goal of simplicity, that we're big believers that kids have to be able to draw these things and they have to feel approachable. Mm-hmm. So the characters are very simple and meant to be, they can be turned into comic strips, and right, like it's creating a story that we want kids to own for themselves, as opposed to something that's so fancy schmancy that they are just passive listeners as opposed to active participants in the learning process. So the whole goal is for it to be approachable. And frankly, like the videos, they start off really simple because we're reaching a wide audience with them, and they get more and more complex. But the simplicity is kind of the beauty. We want everybody to understand it. How you talk about these things can be as complex as you want. So we have teachers using Brain Talk with high schoolers. And are the videos really simple? Yeah, but are they bringing in really cool articles for their high schoolers to read about dopamine or about, cortisol? And they'll often, I don't know if you all have used ASAP Science videos, which are great. ASAP is an ASAP Science. They're also whiteboard animated videos. They're a lot more professional looking than ours because these guys they're good. Okay.
Yeah, I've seen ASAP. Yeah, they're good.
Yeah. They have every topic under the sun. So be careful about just letting kids research it themselves. But they have some great ones based on the brain that are fun to use as additional learning if you're using something like Brain Talk. Ways to make it a little more complex for the kids who are ready for that.
Awesome. So Hanna, there's so much that I would want to keep talking with you about, but we do have a couple of viewer questions Our friend Eric asks, are there any tools that Hanna uses to measure particular EF skills? And how might she look at a baseline and monitor progress? It's a great question.
It is a very good question, because as an SLP, I do not formally assess executive functioning. I really do rely in terms of standardized assessment. That's you guys. So thank you, first and foremost. And secondly, not all kids have access to things like a full neuropsych evaluation, or, you may get kids where they've been assessed by the school, but sometimes the family just didn't know to ask for certain things and don't know how to communicate that their child is struggling in a certain way. And so they don't actually get maybe the scope of assessment that would really help to uncover this stuff. So all that said, there are obviously informal questionnaires that can be really useful. I really prioritize observation and talking to the people who interact with this child, and looking for patterns in the dysregulation. So I didn't touch a lot on emotional regulation, tonight, but excuse me. But how and when are these kids getting dysregulated? Are there the same complaints popping up across classes? That might be where you end up with maybe something of an informal baseline that you actually generate goals from. I don't write goals like so-and-so will improve working memory as demonstrated by, because the capacity is less important than the production. And often it's about giving kids compensatory strategies so that an impairment doesn't actually look as much like an impairment. So my goals will tend to be, or goals that I'll encourage a team to write, let's say, will tend to be more related to like so-and-so will independently identify a strategy to support X, Y, and Z, or independently initiate a strategy. So we're working more towards the student using the strategies that are available to them. So sorry, I'm getting the crazy echo.
That's okay. Maybe if I'm not experiencing feedback, I think I'm okay.
I think, oh, that's good. But yeah, I would say as an SLP, I don't do a lot of formal assessment for executive functioning. I'll use neuropsych evaluations and really interpret them and read through them. Questionnaires that, like, I have an executive functioning Oreo questionnaire that is similar. It's kind of similar to like how the brief asks questions. But it's really, again, it's just looking for patterns in where kids are falling apart. And I think I can't emphasize enough, like, you've got to see these kids, you've got to see them in action to see what it looks like.
Yeah, so it might be helpful to gather some data from self-assessment. Like, is the child recognizing, like, can they have like even a checkbox thing grid on their desk, and every time they return their attention to task, they can mark, a check or an X or something. Or just wondering if they are able to apply what they're learning, and collecting that information might be helpful in terms of discrete skills. But the other question that we have that I want to make sure I get to, and we have two. First, your website mentioned in the facts and frequently asked questions, mentions discount codes for the curriculum. Where can we find one? And lastly, is there a recommendation for the number of sessions with your curriculum with Brain Talk?
Okay, so what I'm going to do at the end, and I don't know how we want to post this, but I will make a discount code for school psych that will just say, it will just be school psych. So we'll get that written so people can literally copy and paste it, because I'm the person who would like spell something wrong or use capitals instead. So wherever it makes sense as a listener for you to go, like, we'll put it on the Facebook page, and maybe we'll put it underneath the YouTube link. And that will be active I can make that active within the hour after we're done. So there's that. And it will kick $10 off of the annual fee. So it brings it from $65 down to $55. And then if schools buy it in bulk, we have additional discounts for bulk. And the other question was about, and really fast, that gives you access to everything. There's lesson plans for early elementary, middle elementary, and middle high school. And it's all of it. And if you just want to see what it's like, the first and third units are completely available and free. You do not have to purchase anything, and you can check out MIG and just see what you think. The other one was about how many sessions. So I would say if you were flying through the curriculum and you were like, I don't necessarily care if the kids get it, I just want to get through it. At a minimum, I would give yourselves 2 sessions per unit. There's 8 units. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting through the whole curriculum with really young kids, because it gets more and more complex. But really, if you can break it down, I don't know how long a lot of school psychs get, because many of the kids I've worked with, like, they might get drop-in support or consult support through a school psych. But if you actually get to meet with students in a group on a weekly basis, my recommendation is just start moving through the curriculum and just move at the pace that the kids are ready for it. And if you get through 4 units with that group, awesome, that's okay. Because it's far more useful for them to understand those 4 units and really apply it than to just fly through the curriculum, hand them a bunch of tools that they don't really understand and they're not ready for. So that's always my recommendation. And if you spend 12 weeks on 2 units, that's great. That's 12 weeks on information that student clearly needed, that they wouldn't otherwise have gotten.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm so excited.
You bet. Good.
Well, I think that about wraps up our time this evening. I'm so happy that people are participating, and we can certainly continue the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. And if you have more questions, we can get them to Hanna and post her responses.
Oh, sorry. And I think our next episode is on the 15th. And I think we're talking dyslexia, right? Okay. Sorry about the echo, everyone, but
yes.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Hanna.